All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, yesterday brought historic scenes of unified resistance by Palestinians in Israel, in Gaza, and in the West Bank, who banded together in protest marches and a general strike which shuttered stores across Israel and across the occupied territories. Now, here is what that looked like in Ramallah. That is in the West Bank, of course. Here's a large protest march in al-Fahim. You can see that here. That's that protest march. Next up, we have some closed shops in the mixed city of Al-Lid, or Lod in Hebrew. You can see this entire market area completely shut down. And look, as a symbolic act, the protest has a huge amount of significance. First of all, use of a general strike as an act of resistance has a long history for Palestinians, reaching all the way back to the years before Israel was even made a state. A 6-month general strike, the longest in history, was mounted to oppose British control over Palestine, brutal economic practices of exploitation, and the theft that even prior to the Israeli state was already dispossessing Palestinians of their lands. That strike was followed by a guerrilla war that was waged by Palestinian peasants against both Jewish settlers and British colonialists. That ended in brutal British suppression, including mass destruction of Palestinian homes. In fact, some are calling Tuesday's general strike the most significant action since that 1936 strike, because it has truly unified Palestinians in resistance. One of the tactics of the Israeli government has been to separate and divide Palestinians. So you have 3 separate experiences governing their lives, depending on whether they're in Israel, in the West Bank, or in Gaza. This tiered system is actually reflected in official Israeli policy, in which it's relatively easy for Palestinians to downgrade their status by moving from Israel to the West Bank or from West Bank to Gaza, but nearly impossible to ascend back up this chain by moving, say, from Gaza to the West Bank or the West Bank into Israel. The Palestinians who manage to hold on to their lands and homes in what is now Israel, they have the most rights afforded to them. They can vote, they can participate in political life, although notably, not a single Arab has ever been part of a governing coalition. But even this group is subject to dozens of Jim Crow-style laws that relegate them to second-class citizenship. So the government school system's wildly unequal. Palestinians in Israel have much higher rates of poverty. Many job opportunities are available only to those who serve in the military. That's a policy which de facto bars Arabs. The flashpoint that triggered the current carnage is a perfect example of blatantly racist laws. While Jewish Israelis have a right to retake land and property that they claim ownership of prior to 1948, Palestinians, they have no such right. That's why settlers claiming deeds to property in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, they believed the courts would allow them to forcibly remove Palestinian families who have lived in those homes for nearly 70 years. As Israel has shifted to the right under Bibi and the most right-wing government to ever have control in the country, the policies aimed at Jewish supremacy and dealing with what they see as an Arab demographic threat, those have become more blatant. So in 2018, they passed a basic law similar to a constitutional amendment, which officially enshrines Jewish supremacy and greenlights increased levels of official state discrimination. So that's Palestinians living in Israel. Palestinians in the West Bank, they don't even have the illusion of equal political rights, of course. Here they are nominally allowed to vote for their own political leadership, but in practice, the contours of daily life are controlled exclusively by Israel. Illegal settlements have shaped the terrain and severely limited movement, changing the West Bank from a contiguous region into a series of disconnected islands. Israel has seized Palestinian lands, claiming them for state use, and then built settlements that make it impossible for Palestinians in many cases to even access their own farmlands. In addition to the settlements, the Israelis have built hundreds of kilometers of highways for use only by settlers who can travel, of course, with ease. Meanwhile, Palestinian residents of the West Bank are subject to humiliating checkpoints and security measures that severely limit economic activity and impede daily life. But nowhere is the suffering as brutal as it is in Gaza, which has been under Israeli blockade since the 2006 election of Hamas. It's worth noting that WikiLeaks revealed the Israeli government officials, they actually celebrated Hamas's takeover of Gaza because it made it easier for Israel to declare the entire region as hostile territory. For all their comments about protecting civilian life, Israel effectively treats all Gazans as terrorists. Gazans are not allowed to fish more than a short distance off their coast. Their airport was bombed and their borders are closed. The 2 million inhabitants of this area are literally trapped in what is often accurately described as an open-air prison. Buildings bombed out long ago remain rubble because of an inability to import construction materials. The drinking water is poisoned. The electricity only works occasionally. Poverty and hunger, they're everywhere. The unemployment rate among young people is 70%. In her documentary, Gaza Fights for Freedom, journalist Abby Martin interviews a father about how difficult it is to feed his large family.
يعني أنا بتجي بتفتح الثلاجة عندي بتلاقيش فيها إشي على الفاضي. أنا عايش على النواشف، على الفلفل، على الخيار، على الدقة، على الزعتر، على الزيتون، على كوباية شاي. يعني شوف فيني أنا وزوجتي قاعدين بنوقد نايلون وورق عشان نوفر الطبخة ونسوي كاسة شاي يعني. بخ على النار ما قلت ما في اليد. ما فيش معي فلوس إني أجيب جرة غاز، جرة الغاز مبلغها 70 شيكل. الحليب برضه وضع سيء، مش قادر اجيب لها، مش قادر اكمل لها، غير بشاي بفتلها وبطعميها. ايش هذه عيشه؟
So the disconnection of these three groups, Palestinians in Israel, in the West Bank, and in Gaza, it's intentional. The differences in their daily life experiences are dramatic. And the show of solidarity between them this week is a powerful statement and a threatening one to those who are very comfortable with the status quo. There's another reason why this is important. Zed Jalani made a good point over on his Substack Inquire. As much as the news media, of course, abhors Hamas violence, that violence is the only time that the news media bothers to cover the Palestinian plight. The years of nonviolent resistance to the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah got literally zero coverage on CNN. And as Glenn Greenwald often points out, other forms of nonviolent resistance, such as the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, are condemned and censored as anti-Semitic. So if your peaceful marches and quixotic court battles are invisible, and your economic directed efforts to oppose apartheid are labeled racist, you've essentially taken all nonviolent tools of resistance off the table. Now, of course, indiscriminate rocket strikes on civilians are never justified. And all of this feeds violence, providing Israel with justification to mow the grass and cowardly politicians to casually abandon their supposedly liberal principles. Perhaps with a general strike, Palestinians during the current moment of media interest have found a tactic that cannot be demonized or ignored. And scholars, activists, people who have spent their lives dedicated to this region say what happened yesterday was truly different for exactly this reason. Yeah. Israelis really depend on both the international perception that Arabs in Israel, what they call Arab Israelis, are treated the same as Jewish residents, that they're happy, that they can ascend. They've got all kinds of stats that they point to. Oh, look at how well they're doing in our society, et cetera, et cetera. So when you have that activist movement within Israel combined with the solidarity movements in the West Bank and Gaza, it does prevent a very different face. And of course, we've been talking here this week about, while Biden has a really old school mentality about Israel, just total like lockstep, they have a right to self-defense, with never recognizing really the human rights of Palestinians or any of the apartheid policies there, there is a big shift in terms of media coverage, and there is a big shift in terms of not just Democratic leaders here in Washington, but the sentiments of the Democratic base towards this issue. In Politico Playbook this morning, they quote one Israel ally in Congress on the Democratic side who went without being named as saying, look, we lost the moral argument on Israel. So the ground is shifting, and it's actions like this that I think are really going to continue to push things forward.
It's very significant. I talked to some friends who cover the region, and I think one of the fascinating things is that Arab Israelis and their relationship with the rest of the Palestinian population has always kind of been fraught and weird, not necessarily allied in the way that you're seeing in the strike. And this is where, and this is why I always talk back about the settlement policy, which is that, about 30 years ago, if you go and you look at the way Arab Israelis felt about armed resistance or even any sort of opposition to the Israeli government, it was not even close to the same way that it is now. I think settlement policy is really the number one thing which has instigated a lot of this. And if you look at the Sheikh Jarrah case, an example, I mean, we're talking about, so it was ruled through the Israeli Supreme Court around, like, it is ruled as like Jewish land or whatever it comes. We're talking about land deeds which are based upon Ottoman documents. This is not a joke. This is like when the Chinese come around, they're like, here's a map from the 1500s which say we own the South China Sea. I'm like, it's 2021. So screw off. The law of armed conflict is
and
what
not to mention,
applies
again,
here.
that law Jewish people in Israel can say, hey, here's my Ottoman documents and here's my claim to this land and this is rightfully mine, and the courts will recognize it. And that is not the case for Palestinians. So it's just a blatantly unequal system in that way.
And the Israeli government would never have allowed this type of stuff to happen even 15, 20 years ago. Like this, they understood that these were the types of things which were going to push the Arab Israeli population away from them in terms of public opinion. And I mean, of course, it always has been something that has been a uniting cause. And the more that the Likud government has gone not only all in on settlements, but has said, settlements is a part of Israeli domestic policy, that has created a much more untenable situation, in my opinion, in Israel, especially with the Arab Israeli population. And I see, I've heard from people in Israel, and they're like, you don't understand, like, what's really happened here is that the Arab Israelis have turned out and have said that, like, we are officially no longer part of your country, and, like, they feel very betrayed. And I'm like, look, it didn't always used to be that way. So what happened? Like, what happened in terms of public opinion, which is that the Likud government has continued this policy. The settlement discussion is something people in the U.S. don't even know about what's happening. They think like conflict just like erupts or whatever, right? And then they're like, oh, it just came out of the vacuum.
Well, the news media
it's really complicated.
Is very invested in being like, it's so complicated you could never understand.
No, I've been saying it's not that hard to understand. Actually.
Well, it's your job to explain it, right? You don't get to just wave your hands and be like, it's complicated, who knows, we'll figure it out sometime, but on to the next thing.
Yeah, I really think that the Israeli government and the commitment to settlements and more has made it an untenable situation for domestic politics in the United States and in their own country, very critically. And that, the more that they do not recognize how that is working against them, public opinion-wise, in Europe, in the U.S., and again, 20% of their own domestic population, that is something which old Israeli politicians understood very, very well if you go back and you read some of the documents and some of the histories of Israel, but now they are starting to forget, or have forgotten for over a decade, and this is kind of the result of that.
It's been partly out of political necessity because Bibi has struggled to form coalitions and has had to go, I'm not letting him off the hook, trust me, but that's part of where this comes from, is he's formed coalitions with increasingly fringe groups, even as Likud has moved because they had a threat from their right, moved to the right, to be more hardline, to be more aggressive, to build more and give more overt support to these illegal settlements. And so, if you have the entire government moving to the right and making it on a daily basis very clear that they do not see you as equal, not only are you going to have a backlash domestically, but it becomes increasingly untenable for liberals here to look at the situation and delude themselves into thinking, oh, this is a free and fair democracy and they share the same values as we do. I mean, we've got our own problems here as well, not letting us off the hook. But I think that's a big part of why, and Bibi inserting himself obviously into partisan politics here, why the ground is shifting so quickly.
And don't forget, the Israeli government, like I said, they used to know this. They evicted people from the West Bank, if Jewish settlers from the West Bank and more, not that long ago. They understood very much how this plays in international politics and within their own domestic politics. So the option was always there for them, and if they wanted to keep things, or if they had wanted to keep things that way, they could have. They made a different choice, and this is the result of that, in my opinion.
All right, Sagar, looking forward to your radar. That's next.